The red numbers you see on your screens are not a glimpse of a typical market panic. This is the aftermath of months of diplomatic maneuvers, decisions made behind closed doors, and finally, the final blow delivered in a single night. On the night of October 8th, the MOEX Russia Index lost more than 4% of its value, falling to its lowest level since September 2022. With this sharp decline, approximately 1.3 trillion rubles evaporated from the Moscow Stock Exchange. That's $160 billion. What happened in Moscow that night was not a market fluctuation or a sudden panic sell-off. It was the result of something much deeper, much more seismic, the collapse of global confidence in Russia. The $160 billion that evaporated in a single night was the silent bankruptcy flag of an empire. This was not an emotional panic sale, but a cold-blooded and strategic decision to evacuate. The foreign capital that had been flowing into Russia for decades, the money that had inflated those giant companies with oil money, suddenly received the order to withdraw. Russian economic giants like Gazprom, Rosneft, and Sberbank suddenly became hollow shells, because the international capital and confidence that made them valuable was now gone. It wasn't just the Western giant investment funds in New York or London that picked up on this signal. What was truly shocking was that investors in Beijing, Mumbai, and even some capitals seen as Russia's closest allies joined this flight. To understand the financial carnage that night, one must set aside traditional market analysis. What happened was not a disruption of supply and demand, or investors succumbing to momentary panic. The main reason underlying everything was the irreversible collapse of relations between the US and Russia. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine meant only one thing for international capital. Russia was no longer a player that played by the rules, but an unpredictable and radioactive pariah state that was dynamiting the global system. Global capital's confidence in a country does not die overnight. Like a slowly spreading cancer, it dies step by step over years. The total collapse we witnessed on the night of October 8th was actually the final and most painful stage of a decay that had been going on for decades. When Putin pulled the trigger that night, he had actually loaded the bullet into the chamber years ago. Here are the stones that paved the road to the death of trust, from those rotten foundations to the moment of final rupture. First and foremost, there were the rotten foundations. The economic model Putin built after coming to power in the early 2000s was a structure with a rotten foundation, hidden behind shiny skyscrapers and luxury shopping malls. 3 deadly sins, highlighted for years in international investor reports, were gnawing away at the foundations of this structure. Systemic corruption, the complete erosion of the rule of law, and an oligarchic structure. Starting a business or investing in Russia depended not on a predictable legal system, but on knowing the right people in the Kremlin. Property rights could change hands overnight, not by court order, but by telephone command. This situation had always made Russia a high-risk market governed by Wild West rules. Investors turned a blind eye to this risk for a while, attracted by the huge profits generated by high oil prices. However, everyone knew that the foundations of trust in this structure had already cracked and were doomed to collapse at the first major storm. That first major storm came with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the first major crack. When Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in defiance of international law, the first red alert sounded for global capital. This was the first clear declaration that Russia would not play by the rules, not only domestically, but also internationally, and that it was an unreliable and aggressive actor. Although the initial Western sanctions imposed at that time were mild compared to today's, their psychological impact was enormous. That day, trust in Russia suffered its first deep wound. Many Western funds reassessed their risk perceptions and began to gradually reduce their investments in Russia. 2014 was an irreversible breaking point in the death process of trust. And finally, the ultimate break from the global system, the suicide trigger. The order to invade Ukraine in its entirety and the subsequent diplomatic moves that completely severed relations with the US meant that Putin himself pulled out the last supporting pillar under the already rotten structure of trust. With the invasion order, Putin sent this message to the global system. International law, economic rationality, or stability mean nothing to me. I am only pursuing my own imperial dreams, and I am prepared to burn everything in my path. This was the last thing global capital wanted to hear. At that moment, investing in Russia ceased to be merely risky. It became moral and strategic suicide. For the sake of his own geopolitical gamble, Putin severed his country's last bond of trust with the global economy with his own hands. What happened on the night of October 8th was nothing more than the financial consequence of this suicide. In fact, US President Donald Trump had offered Putin a way out. Because in global markets and geostrategy, Putin's Russia was a powerful actor. With Trump's offer, Putin had sold the Russian people hope 2 months earlier. Thanks to a possible Alaska summit with Donald Trump, relations with the US would be back on track. Washington's heavy sanctions would be eased, and international isolation would be broken. This scenario dominated state media headlines for weeks. The Kremlin presented this possibility as a diplomatic victory. Domestic economic difficulties, losses on the front lines, and the depreciation of the ruble were temporarily overshadowed by this expectation. For a brief but effective period, this expectation was also reflected in Russian financial markets. The MOEX Index rose, Russian companies' stocks gained value, and investors slowed their dollar purchases. Some commentators even described this process as the stock market rally brought on by Putin's peace signal. However, this fragile optimism did not last long. After the summer of 2025, weeks of mounting diplomatic tension between Washington and Moscow, particularly over espionage allegations, nuclear threats, and military activity in the Baltic region, escalated to a point of no return on October 8th. This was a calculated and inevitable collapse, resulting from the rupture of a geopolitical fault line. This situation was even openly acknowledged by Russian officials. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said that the structure of Russia-US relations is cracking and collapsing. The cracks have reached the foundation. This statement instantly destroyed investor confidence, which was already fragile. As a result, many critical companies, particularly the country's largest energy and financial giants, experienced sharp declines in their share prices. Gazprom lost 4.1% of its value in a single day, despite its critical position in the global energy market. Sberbank, Russia's largest bank, fell 4.9% as investors began to view it as a risky asset. Energy giant Rosneft fell 2.5%, while national airline Aeroflot's shares lost 5% of their value. Industrial and metal giant Severstal lost nearly 5% due to instability in the iron and steel sector and difficulties in steel exports. However, the collapse was not limited to these companies. Other major players, such as Mechel and Rostelecom, also lost more than 6% of their value. But the real meaning of this decision was hidden not in diplomatic notes, but in the signals read by global capital. This signal was extremely clear and ruthless. Translated into the language of global capital, it was a chilling signal that meant only one thing. The era of doing business with Russia is over. This was much more than a new sanctions list or freezing the assets of a few oligarchs. It was the official branding of Russia as a whole as an uninvestable pariah state by the global financial system. For massive investment funds seeking safe havens, this meant that a part of the map had suddenly been painted black and marked off limits. The power of this signal stemmed from its universality. The result it produced was not panic, but a comprehensive and rational capital flight. And the most shocking thing was that the flight did not come only from Western funds. Even its closest allies had begun to lose confidence in Russia. Capital from Beijing and New Delhi, which the Kremlin had promoted for years as strategic partners and alternatives to the West, also began issuing exit orders within the same hours. Even investors from Kazakhstan, one of Russia's most dependent allies, entered a ruthless race to liquidate their assets in Moscow at any cost. Because the issue was no longer about making a profit or cutting losses, the issue was about saving the entire principal from a market that had become toxic within hours. This was not a panic sale. It was hundreds of different actors making the same rational decision at the same time. Be the first to abandon the sinking ship. While this main collapse was unfolding, secondary factors were also fueling the fire. News of Ukraine's strategic successes on the front lines, which shattered Russian defense doctrine, reverberated not in military analysts' reports, but in investors' risk algorithms. Russia's deepening domestic fuel crisis and production disruptions caused by refinery fires were the most concrete evidence that the country's economic engine was already sputtering. These secondary factors alone might not have triggered such a massive collapse. However, when combined with the main shockwave created by the diplomatic apocalypse, they created a perfect storm that eliminated any hope of recovery, accelerated the collapse, and made it irreversible. That night, the Moscow Stock Exchange did not just lose value, it lost its raison d'etre in the global system. This was a tangible and devastating price, stolen from the future of a country of 140 million people. The bill for a cocky move on the diplomatic chessboard was paid directly by ordinary Russian citizens in their kitchens, their retirement dreams, and their children's futures. The ruthless ripple effect of this bankruptcy penetrated deep into Russian society and the war machine. The first and most ruthless blow fell on the people's money. That $160 billion was not just the value of a few oligarchs' mansions in London. The overwhelming majority of this money was locked up in the pension funds that millions of ordinary Russian citizens had saved throughout their lives, in deposits in state banks and in small investments in local companies. Overnight, the savings of teachers, doctors, workers, and small business owners were virtually wiped out. People who had trusted the state's financial system, believing in the fairy tale of a strong and stable Russia that Kremlin propaganda had been telling them for years, suffered the greatest betrayal of their lives. This was not just a loss of money, but also a tearing up of a social contract. The state had failed to fulfill its duty to protect the welfare of its citizens. Instead, it had thrown them into the fire for its own political adventures. The people paid the price for diplomatic mistakes. The second and strategically more important wave hit Russia's war machine. Modern wars are waged not only with tanks and missiles, but also with the enormous economic power to produce, maintain, and deploy them. A state that has completely lost access to global capital and whose financial credibility has been destroyed cannot finance a modern army for long. This collapse severed the lifeline of the Russian defense industry. The ability to import foreign components required for high-tech weapon systems disappeared. The capacity to borrow to cover the enormous costs of the war vanished. Most importantly, the hope of retaining the country's brightest minds and talented engineers has been extinguished. Because an economy that has lost its credibility, and consequently its ability to attract investment, cannot offer talented people a future. This is not the sudden death of the war industry, but a slow and painful erosion, technological regression, and ultimately collapse. What happened on the stock market that night was not just a financial disaster, but also a time bomb planted under Putin's war machine. The battlefield was no longer just Ukraine's muddy trenches, but also Moscow's stock market, and the loss there would be much more lasting. So where did Putin go wrong? Actually, the results were very clear. The Kremlin, which for years had fed on a policy of tension with the West, constantly creating enemies abroad to consolidate nationalist sentiments at home, failed to calculate that this strategy had an expiration date. The latest diplomatic moves, which completely severed relations with the US, were actually Putin pulling the last stone from the already crumbling foundation of trust with his own hands. This was strategic blindness. The Kremlin had convinced itself that the rest of the world would remain forever dependent on Russian energy and raw materials, and therefore even its most radical political steps would have no economic consequences. However, they forgot that the global economy of the 21st century relies more on capital flows moving at digital speed and operating with a single currency than on pipelines. Trust. By pulling that trigger, Putin did not just burn a diplomatic bridge. He bombed his country's last port of entry into the global ocean of capital with his own hands. The events of October 8 were the inevitable final stop on this long and painful journey. As the smoke from the financial wreckage cleared, the Kremlin's propaganda machine immediately began operating at full capacity. State-controlled television channels, expert economists, and government officials all began telling the same story in unison. This, according to them, was a speculative attack by the West. An artificial crisis created by enemies afraid of Russia's rise, manipulating the markets. This narrative had been successfully used for years to control domestic public opinion. But this time, there was a crack in the wall too big to hide behind. This time, the reason was not an imaginary enemy from outside, but the Kremlin's own actions. And covering up this truth was impossible. The reason for the collapse of the propaganda wall was simple. The cause of this crisis was not complex financial algorithms or the actions of secret speculators, but an extremely concrete event that took place in full view of everyone. Russia cutting all diplomatic ties with the West with its own hands. The Kremlin could tell its people that the market attacked us, but it could not say that we closed all channels of communication with the world, and as a result, everyone withdrew their money. That would have been an admission of suicide, not weakness. Tens of thousands of comments mocking the state's official statements spread across social media and Telegram channels. Even ordinary people could see that it was no coincidence that the stock market crash began just hours after the news of the severing of diplomatic relations. This was the moment the Kremlin lost the battle for control over the flow of information. The truth was too naked for propaganda to cover up. After this obvious failure, the regime resorted to what it knew best: repression and control. To delay the impact of the bankruptcy on people's daily lives and prevent a full-blown bank panic, a kind of financial martial law was declared. Capital controls were imposed, foreign currency withdrawals were restricted, and companies were banned from transferring money abroad. On paper, these measures might have appeared to be steps taken to bring the situation under control, but in reality, they were desperate measures, akin to trying to plug the massive holes in a sinking ship with your bare hands. They were a band-aid, but they lacked the power to stop the internal bleeding. These panic decisions sent foreign investors one more message: your money could be trapped in this market. This created yet another reason for even the last remaining crumbs of capital to flee. While attempting to manage the crisis, the Kremlin actually deepened it and laid bare, in all its nakedness, the inescapable reality of the execution it had brought upon itself. What happened on the night of October 8th was not just a loss of $160 billion, but a strategic checkmate that fundamentally changed Russia's place and future on the global stage. The long-term consequences of this defeat are far more devastating and lasting than the immediate financial shock. That night, Russia lost not only its money, but also its economic sovereignty and the prosperity of future generations. For years, Putin's biggest propaganda tool was the claim that Russia was an independent, self-sufficient, sovereign economic power, not dependent on the West. That claim was shattered that night. Ostracized from the global financial system, Russia has now turned itself into a black hole. No international investment fund, no pension company, no serious capital can now risk investing in Russia in the foreseeable future. This situation is pushing Russia into an increasingly narrow dead end, ultimately leaving only one route for survival: complete submission to China. Moscow's burning of all bridges with the West has brought with it not only political but also economic suicide. The Kremlin's ability to maintain its foreign exchange reserves, sustain industrial production, access high technologies, and run its war economy now depends entirely on credit lines, investment flows, spare parts, and the banking system provided by China. Putin's claim to sovereignty, built over years on the rhetoric of a multipolar world, has effectively begun to crumble. This is because China is a much tougher, more pragmatic, and more interest-driven actor than the West in this new relationship of dependency. Beijing sees Russia's decline not as a diplomatic crisis, but as a geo-economic opportunity. The name of this opportunity is full economic influence. Russia can no longer set prices when selling energy to China or impose conditions when purchasing technology. Discussions on customs unions, currency swaps, cross-border investments, all of these are transforming into a system centered on Beijing's interests, not Moscow's. Russia's massive natural gas projects now depend on China's appetite for purchases. Even the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline has become a symbol of this one-way dependency. The second major strategic consequence is not merely economic turbulence, it is the mortgaging of Russia's future. We are talking about a deep and lasting structural collapse, not a temporary crisis. Because the real capital of the 21st century economy is no longer natural resources. It is innovation, advanced technology, and high efficiency. These three elements have only one fuel: investment. And investment has only one source: trust. However, the financial earthquake that occurred on the night of October 8th reduced this confidence in Russian markets to almost zero. As stocks collapsed, not only did the wealthy of that day disappear, but also the factories, software companies, research centers, and university laboratories that would have been born in the future. Because capital does not tolerate insecurity. For scientists, entrepreneurs, and investors, predictability is as important as economic stability. That night, the Kremlin destroyed both of these pillars. This means that Russia has pulled the plug on its growth engine in a way that it will not be able to recover from for decades to come. In an economic environment where new technologies cannot be developed, production chains cannot be modernized, and brain drain cannot be reversed, Russia is losing not only today, but also the prosperity of future generations. While rival countries are taking revolutionary steps in areas such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and green energy, Russia is still struggling to keep Soviet-era factories afloat and survive on primitive sectors such as iron and steel production. This means that a superpower is slowly falling into the third world category. Worse still, this collapse was not imposed from outside, but was a form of auto-castration carried out by the Kremlin itself. Every step taken to disconnect from the international community was actually cutting off the country's technological, scientific, and economic lifelines. This chain of decisions, which has cost not only today but also tomorrow, is a country silently executing its own future. The result is clear. Those who lose trust lose their future. If this video has given you a new perspective on Russia's economic future, the Kremlin's strategic mistakes, and the devastating effects on society, if you can see how this collapse has deepened not only through war, but also through wrong decisions, don't forget to show your support. You can help us reach more people by liking the video, and you can empower us to continue this kind of content by subscribing. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, ask questions, or leave suggestions for further analysis. Remember, this is not just the story of a war, it is also a document of how a system collapsed by its own hand. See you in the next video.